What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here. I'm the design lead of Summoner's Rift Team's live pod, and I'm here to talk to you about a set of AP item changes that are currently on the PBE that is likely, though not guaranteed, to go live with patch 25.10 in about 2 weeks' time. I am the one who is doing the implementation work here. I am essentially leading this project, but as always, the things we do are a team effort. I'm not on an island and ignoring feedback, whatever. And of course, you will see over the course of the days, and in fact, if you watch this video before the next PBE update, these will be changes that aren't even on the PBE yet. I want to talk about the process of diving into an item system and making plans and comparing across items and trying to ensure that things land in a good state. And so I want to talk you through sort of how I think about this and some of the back and forths that have been had and where we're headed likely and what, some version of what's likely to happen here. So again, I want to reiterate that right now as of recording, this is Wednesday evening. Localization lock is going to be on Friday evening. Basically, that's going to be the go, no go, because some of these changes will require localization changes, will require meaningful tooltip changes. We might rip it all out by the end of Friday if we are not happy with the the project or progress at that point in time. That's fine. That's always kind of baked into things like this. I personally don't mind working out of release and seeing stuff go to PBE, getting unfiltered player feedback, things like that, and then iterating and going from there. I think it's generally a pretty big positive, and so I like to work that way. Let's talking about AP item changes. So first off, a couple topics to bring up here. All right, so the first one is something that I don't think everyone's going to agree with, although I believe this very, very strongly, which is when you're talking about items specifically, game health versus item excitement. Your first order need with items or systems in general really is the health of the game. It is more important that items do what you want and serve their champions well than be by themselves exciting. Now, the reason the word "and" is here is because you would like to maximize item excitement, assuming you're already hitting the game health needs. Right? You want to maximize that, but your primary goal is make the right things for the game, make the right choices, and then do what you can to hit a local maximum on excitement, assuming you're still hitting your game health goals. Okay, so some items are going to become less exciting. There's going to be less text on them. I love deleting text off of items and abilities when I can, because it allows them to be more focused. It gets us to lower complexity in League, which is a good thing overall. The game is exceedingly complex and hard to get into, and chipping away at that is helpful when you can. But the most important thing is not a sick tooltip where you're fantasizing about what you could do. It's no, let's make a good item that champions want to use and that we are okay with and happy with the outputs of that item on those champions. And it is okay to sacrifice excitement for game health. I think that is the worst, the opposite of much worse, right? You don't want an unhealthy game, but there's exciting items. The champions come first by a lot. And so I want to be very clear about that seeing a tooltip being it's a lot exciting is not a huge problem to me. That is how I feel. And it is sort of what is, a part of what is driving this project. The next thing is a look at numerical balance and an overall framework for this. So I've got a spreadsheet with every item in the game, and I've basically got a bunch of named data variables that are here is what attack damage is worth, here's what ability power is worth, here's what mana and mana regen are worth, and heal and shield power, and individual proc damage, if you're going to trigger an energize or a Luden's proc or whatever, or a burn. Those are different, of course, because they're not all up front, and they all have different considerations and cooldowns and whatnot. And so there's a big list of here's what this stat is worth, and then that gets to filter into every item we build. And so we're okay, what's the gold efficiency of this item? I have a personal framework for items with diverse stats that don't hard synergize. Functionally, attack damage or AP and health commands a higher efficiency on the item. Giving percent penetration, I guess you could think of it as, well, just in your mind make percent pen a less valuable stat. I think of it more as the items that do things that we want, that are meant to be pretty good in some situations, are just allowed to be more efficient overall, and some framework around that. Additionally, every item spits out its through this frameworking of how much value is in each of these buttons, in each of these stats and uniques and whatever, versus price and etc. How much of the item is in offense, defense, or utility, and understanding that when we look at an item and I'm like, here's Leandries or here's Crypt Bloom or here's whatever. Okay, is this item mostly offense, largely offense? Is it half and half? Is it very durable? Is it tanky? Like, what's going on here? And at the end of the day, as we continue to iterate through items and get information and get feedback from players, we get to further fine-tune and hone this framework to be more and more and more accurate, and say, okay, we look back at this, and after the AP item nerfs and every other class's item nerfs back in 14-19, okay, well, here's what we thought we were hitting. Okay, how close were we to that? Okay, cool, we're actually pretty close. All right, this thing was off, that thing was off. Okay, here's adjustments we can make. Okay, cool, we should make sure we try a little bit harder in thinking about how often we're doing single target burst and, access and things like that. And, we hone and hone and hone and get better and better and better. So as it is right now, most AP items are actually pretty close to balanced. Again, yes, Leandries is actually one of the best AP items in the game. Yes, last patch, Rod of Ages is one of the best AP items in the game. Yes, Ludens and Malignants and Merlamicon are not very good. Yes, Bloodletter's Curse is not very good. Those things are true. And the nice thing, the better the framework gets tuned, it's like, yep, not only is this true from like champion usage and win rate data, not only is this true from player surveys, which we have pretty recently stood up a decent player survey where we just ask, hey, what balancing do you think should have been in the previous patch? What should we have buffed? What should we have nerfed? And so it's not going to like drive a lot of our decision making because there's more to it than just a player survey. But it's good to know, like, actually, it's funny because, for example, for the last couple of months, players were like, Rod of Ages is a kind of weak item. Like, first of all, not a lot of people talked about Rod of Ages in the survey, but those who did, it's like multiple choice, like pick an item and then, say buff for nerf, basically, right? It's like, okay, people didn't tend to bring up Rod of Ages much, but those who did tended to say this item is underpowered. And we added a Ruby Crystal to the build path. And it went from no one really talks about Roa, but they kind of think it's underpowered, to Roa is the most talked about AP item and everything is overpowered. I don't think a Ruby Crystal in the build path is going to change that, but going from like February of this year to April of this year was an obvious massive change on like a 4x order of magnitude. On a magnitude of about 4 times, right? Again, Ruby Crystal does not go from an item no one talks about to the best item in the game. Survey is very much how people think, not reality, but it's like good to see things like that. Of note also is things like, oh, actually, people on average, by the way, in the AP item system, people roughly say buff as often as they say nerf. Like, if you take that as like a if you take that as a blank, how strong people think the system is, which is not actually accurate, to be clear. It's not how it uses it all, but as an example, people tend to say buff as much as they say nerf in the AP item space. So with that in mind, it's like, yeah, it's roughly neutral. And then as of, 4 weeks ago, Rod of Ages is like 5-1 nerf this item. And it's the most responded to item in the list. By comparison, Seraph's Embrace has like consistently been like 2-1 nerf this item with like a moderate like response size every time. And Blackfire Torch, like 2-1 moderate response volume every single patch. Like Blackfire Torch, kind of an OP item. And then what's interesting is even items that are actually underpowered, Storm Surge, Ludens, Malignants, those come in with pretty consistent and fairly high volume. This item is overpowered feedback. Which is interesting that like people who are saying, hey, I want to talk about AP items, a decent portion of players come in and say, hey, I think Ludens is OP, I think Malignus is OP, these AP burst items are kind of OP. They don't say it for Deathcap, they don't say it for Void Staff, but I think it's kind of interesting. So it's an interesting gut check of like, sure, it's biased towards people who are willing to respond to a survey. Yes, right? That's not, the exact representative average League of Legends player, but it's way more representative than say like a Twitter thread or like whoever's posting, their most recent, Twitch video or something, right? Or Twitch clip on YouTube, whatever. Anyway, all this to say that we have a whole bunch of things that point into, what are people actually building? What is their actual like win rate data? And it's not just like literally win rate of slot. There's more to it than that. But again, the actual like statistically measured item power data There's frameworking of actual item balance and like how strong things actually are and aren't. So for example, one thing with Leandries is I knew I wasn't nerfing Leandries enough relative to everything else. Like it was still one of the biggest nerfs of the patch in 14-19, but I knew Leandries was still OP from the framework I had. And also Rod of Ages, by the way. Actually, both those were like, these items are ridiculously silly. These are clearly OP, but like, there's no way I can nerf this thing by like 15%. No one's gonna get it because Roa hadn't caught on, right? And then like we fast forward 6 months, and it's like, oh yeah, everyone thinks Roa's the best item, and they think Leander's also the best item. Like, yeah, I knew that. So in some cases, this frameworking works, but in some cases, I still have to wait for players to understand as well. So again, a mix of data sources that kind of creates a whole picture. There are some that I think have very large misalignments. So I think Crypt Bloom is much stronger than players think it is. Just like pretty much full stop. Crypt Bloom is actually a pretty good item. I agree it doesn't look good. It doesn't look like it is a strong item. I'm quite confident this item is actually good. Obviously the user base is quite small because no one thinks it is, and that's tough. That's like, hey, there was a problem here where this item is probably actually good, but it doesn't look that way. Let's go solve that as well. Let's move on to the next topic here. Okay, so class definitions and champion affinities. So I have been a fan for a while, and from what I have seen in my 2 years and change so far doing design in League, that this mental model for me, is actually pretty good and bears fruit, in that I get the results I think I'm going to get, and the game goes in the right direction. So what do you mean by this? Is so champions generally belong to a class. Now, every champion is actually unique. We should not pretend that champions are actually in a box and that all AP fighters are the same, or all AP assassins are the same, or all control mages are the same. They all have their own unique needs and wants, and that is totally fine. But the general idea is that, hey, we can probably paint you with a fairly broad brush in a subclass of champions and say, you're probably going to want these things, you're probably going to not want these other things, you're probably going to really need these couple of things. And that's tend to be true. And it's allowed us to design items toward a broad swath of champions using class definitions and then gut checking across the actual individual champions themselves and making sure that they have builds that work. The corollary to this is champion affinities. And this is saying that, well, you are, let's say, an AD fighter. And as an AD fighter, assuming you're not like full-on Master Yi or Yasuo or Yone or something, maybe you're Sent, maybe you're Darius, maybe you are Vi, maybe you're Fiora. You do the same thing for AP, of course, right? Maybe you're Gwen, maybe you're Mordekaiser. They're quite far apart here, but hey, you're an AP or AD fighter. You're going to want sources of damage. You're not an assassin, so you're going to want some kind of repeatability. This could be ability haste, it could be attack speed, it could be auto attack damage incentives like Hullbreaker. Even Trinity Force with a short cooldown is a very repeated thing that asks you, hey, you might want to get haste with this to make sure you've got a 2-second cooldown on your next hit button, right? Like it's worth getting more haste on Jax so that your Jax W is close to Triforce's cadence, right? That's actually valuable, it's useful. And like he likes Shojin a decent amount for that reason, right? It's part of the reason. Anyway. And so saying that, yeah, that's where your offense comes from. We're not going to give you lethality because that's a burst stat, right? That is a multiplier on damage per cast. What we want is you to cast more often. We want this type of champion who wants to be repeatable, right? So they want to be repeatable, so they need the durability and the tools to stay in the fight in order to repeat. And that means that champs that want to burst don't need to be repeatable. It means we can cut haste from those items. It means we can give high amounts of attack damage or ability power. It means we can give lethality or flat pen. It means we can give large amounts of AD or AP or whatever. And as long as we say, okay, well, yes, is this champion kit we have, is this actually going to have an affinity for high amounts of burst or high amounts of repeatability or whatever else, and to kind of build those out. And then, right, that allows you to come back and say, well, okay, let me look at what Fiora's building or what Ziggs is building or what Seraphine is building or what Talia is building and say, hey, does it match your expectations, right? How does this champion actually function in the game? What do their team fight patterns actually look like? What are the items that they are building in order to enable that gameplay pattern? Is this matched? Does this align with what we want to do? Does it not align with what we want to do? Is this okay? And sort of figuring all those things out, right? And making sure that, like, actually, yes, this is useful. And the reason why, before we go down the bottom half of this about items themselves, is I think it is important that when you see a champion, it behaves the way you expect, like Mundo should be very big, very tanky. The regen should be noticeable. He can clearly withstand several hits. And actually, yeah, a guy with big cleaver attacks you and deals really good damage. And so he's threatening. He is a juggernaut. He is a regen heavy champion. But when you look at Mundo, you know what's going on. And by making sure that his kit has the right incentives on it, making sure that there are items that feed into those incentives and that feel good, and so that when you look at Mundo, you know what Mundo does. When you look at Mundo's items, it reinforces that's what Mundo does. And so that at kind of all levels of skill, the whole like point of a champion and their expression of the champion fantasy and all that all kind of works out, right? And it all kind of aligns, right? That's all sort of all wrapped in. Champions and items, again, champions are more important, but champions and items are pretty much, they're locked together. They are basically, how am I trying to say this? They're intertwined, so you still have to care about both, even though there is a clear, like, champions are more important than items. Items should serve champions. Let's make sure these items serve champions appropriately. I think it's enough for that. I can go on for this for longer, but this is good enough for now. So let's now talk about item purpose, right? Through the lens of, well, we have individual champions, we have champion classes, we have champion affinities, we have stat affinities, things like that. An item needs to serve a purpose. Now, an item's purpose is not has equal pick rate with all other items. If we have an expectation that an item is meant to be niche and it's not niche, there's probably a problem there. For example, several years ago, it was correct on every AD fighter to rush Chempunk Chainsword. It was just a better black cleaver. You should always buy it. And at a certain point, Riot had nerfed it. It was no longer better than cleaver. People were really slow to switch off, but eventually they switched off. They did the right thing. But when you're like, hey, Chempunk Chainsword is there to be a good Grievous Wounds items. We should not expect you to buy Chempunk Chainsword every game. And then Vi versus Chempunk Chainsword first slot with no healers, and it's like, we failed somewhere. Something is wrong. The item is not serving its purpose correctly. Crypt Bloom being a percent magic pen item for champs who would rather have haste than a stack of AP is the purpose of Crypt Bloom. But if no one's buying it, there's a problem, because someone should want haste more than AP. Okay, well, something's wrong that no one thinks this item is approachable or reasonable or whatever. Mercurial Scimitar is very rare. Good, we don't want you to default to QSS all the time. It's not meant to be the default grab that makes you beat Ashe. It's going to occasionally be the thing you go and buy when you're facing a Malzahar or something, but it's fine that it's rare. It's not meant to be common. That's fine. Right? It's not your generic I get MR stat stick for an AD carry. To talk about AD carry some more, I don't/we don't want AD carries to buy a defensive item every single game. Shield Bow and Bloodthirster, and sometimes there's binding, right? Bloodthirster is a pretty big deal for especially Draven, but it's pretty common on someone like Samira as well. And, you know, Shield Bow, we do expect on Yasuo and Yone. It's like very reasonable that this melee fighter who wants crit chance and wants to deal a lot of damage, but isn't an assassin, needs durability somewhere, and it's not offered much in the crit system. Shield Bow is meant to be very, very good on Yasuo and Yone. That's its purpose, and indeed it is. And that's great, and we're happy about that. And yet it's not that great on Tryndamere because he has his R, and he doesn't really care that much. Great, working as intended. Meanwhile, it is situationally playable on a bunch of AD carries. Cool. They shouldn't be defaulting to getting 500 bonus health every game. Now, we can overall tune the game to make sure the amount of damage and durability overall is appropriate, yes, but that is not meant to be cribbing on Shield Bow to get us there. It's, let's tune the game correctly such that combat is going the way we want it to. And then, hey, you can moderately increase your durability by getting a Bloodthirster or a Shield Bow, and that's an occasionally acceptable purchase. That's its purpose. That's why it's there. And so you can kind of go down on that some more and be like, hey, Rocket Belt, who is Rocket Belt meant to serve? Well, right now it serves what I call Circle Ultimate Champions. It's for Fiddlesticks and Kennen and Nico, champions who want to make sure they can insert themselves in any team, make sure their ult does a lot of damage and hits as many targets as possible, and it's very kit bound. And one thing we think we can do is be like, well, it should also be in the cards for a lot of kind of generic melee AP fighters, from Echo to Silas to, you know, Fringe Evelyn, to be honest, but like assassin-ish fighters. You know, Mordekai's be quite Fringe here. That wouldn't really be the expectation here. While, you know what, maybe we are willing to woo occasionally those assassin-y champions. Like Akali is actually a bit fightery, and Akali would be a reasonable champion here. Evelyn would be kind of a stretch, but like, sure, Evelyn might buy this once in a while to make sure she has target access to land the charm. Okay, fine. But like, we don't expect Evelyn to buy Rocket Belt every game. We don't expect Akali to buy Rocket Belt every game, but like, it's in the pool. That would be reasonable. That's you know, the shot call on class definitions and champion affinities are like, yeah, actually, if you're playing a more fightery style build, I could totally see Rocket Belt being reasonable on the suite of champions. So it serves a purpose here. And so that leads to the next thing, which is item specificity and broadness, talking about uniques, and then we'll talk about the Unending Despair line a little bit later. So Item specificity and broadness is basically talking about the kind of stat profile and or unique effects an item has that tells you who should and shouldn't buy it. So for example, Death Cap, in its extreme simplicity, does a really good job of telling you who it's for. It is extremely expensive. It is a multiplier on the amount of AP you have, and it has no durability whatsoever. So immediately, you're looking at Mordekaiser or Singed or any other like actual fighter, Diana probably, like she can almost get away with this. It's like, oh, this is not for me. This is high burst for champions with high AP, such that they got 100 AP on their other slots, and they want to do another big chunk of damage, another 30% or so more damage. That's who Death Cap's for. And with literally 2 lines of text, Death Cap is really obvious. Void Staff, also 2 lines of text, also really obvious. Big stack of AP, bunch of percent Magic Pen to say, oh, they started building MR, time to buy a Void Staff. And it serves its purpose really well. Now, the nice thing is, by Death Cap and Void Staff having no other text on them, there was nothing there to further sharpen them to be like, hey, but also, did you know it does double ability power on Tuesday, or it's melee range modded, and that can be useful if you need to target your user base better, or you can be like, this item does what it's supposed to do. It's, fairly capstone in its design, and it's for high AP users who don't need more durability or don't want more durability. And so some assassins can buy it, and plenty of mages can buy it when they're trying to go for a burstier build. But it's not so strongly tuned that you literally always buy it, right? It's like, yeah, this is good when you can get it, and it's obvious in its purpose, right? And so talking about uniques, for example, right? This is why, for example, you can have things like... and it's why, spoiler for later in this video, I deleted one of the passives off of Horizon Focus. Horizon Focus is a large amount of damage and a large amount of ability haste with no durability onto it. You can think of a lot of champions who want those 3 lines of text. A lot of AP, a lot of haste, and I don't want to be more durable. Now, there's some champions who want the first 2, and they can build a Cosmic Drive, and they're like, that's not exactly what I want. And in fact, people are generally not going to be happy that Cinder's running around with an extra 300 health, because that's not what she's not meant to be, that durable, right? Syndra is not generally like, she's meant to use her mobility to stay out of range and stay out of reach. And when you catch her, she's meant to kind of die. She has really, really good pick tools with QE. She has really, really good peel tools with QE. She has really, really high mobility with Q and W, not requiring you to stop to cast. This champion is meant to be squishy. And if her best in class ability haste access is 350 health on it with Cosmic Drive, well, there are problems with the game when... But at the same time, we want Cosmic Drive to be good for the Lilias and Mordekaisers and Echoes and whatnot of the world, where they actually want to stand, they want to deal damage, rumble, and so on, where it's like, no, this is very legitimate on them, and they would actually use the health, and this would be appropriate for them. And yes, you could melee range mod, I understand, but like, well, we have champions like Cassiopeia or Ryze or Swain where, no, they also deserve durability, and they also are playing at a range where they're going to take hits and they're going to give some back. And like, that is an entire class of champions that also deserves health items. And a melee range mod would alienate those champions. Instead, how about we just make a corollary to Cosmic Drive that is for Syndra and for Orianna and for Victor. Victor, you could argue a little bit, he's a little bit of a battle mage. And it's like, actually, what this means to me is that Horizon Focus's Hypershot unique is serving to erroneously shrink the user base when there's a whole bunch of control mages and artillery mages alike, not all of which hit at 700 range or 600 range, but would like a stack of ability power with a lot of ability haste and no health on it, right? And by having these good items without health on them that you're willing to buy, that you feel good about, well, this allows burst builds to be good, because your opponent didn't get 400 health on 2 other slots. This allows assassins overall, whether they're AD or AP, to be good, because that mid laner didn't get 400 health in 2 of those slots. That's useful. That is a good thing for the game, because it allows champions to have the weakness they're meant to have. Again, shield build being an every AD carry build is not a good result. A Cosmic Drive being in a bunch of squishy AP builds is not a good result. Let them go build a Horizon Focus and feel better about that item. Right? That's the intent, and that's talking basically, I hope that example made sense, of using uniques and using stat profiles to specify who an item is for and getting the appropriate broadness to them. Another example here would be Leandri's Torment having the Madness passive, where having a slowly ramping more damage over time allows his item to push itself toward, still having a line of text that says your kit deals more damage, allows it to move toward champs who might have low AP ratios, which generally would not be a burst champion, would allow it to move toward longer combat patterns, right? This is Zack and Amumu, but also um, Lilia or Rumble or Mordekaiser or Singed, where like, yeah, most of the time you're fighting, we're clearly going to be at the full 3-second duration and 6% damage amp here on Madness. If you're doing a one-shot combo with Orianna, you're probably not. And so that is a line of text that says, hey, this item is slightly better for long duration fighters. Now, you might be able to get that anyway with stat specificity, sure, but it is what a unique like that does is help to broadcast who it's for if ability power, haste, health, move speed, things like that aren't enough to do what you want. Now, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, but that is sometimes what uniques are for. Sometimes to give a unique effect that is like this item has a purpose, and that purpose is the unique effect, such as a max health burn. And sometimes it's to say, hey, this is for champions who ramp in damage, or a way to lock Omnivamp behind being in combat for a long time and not just always standing off waves, which is what Riftmaker is doing, right? This conditional Omnivamp. And so a somewhat corollary point here, is why I mentioned Unending Despair, is the fairly recent update to Unending Despair, which was giving it double resists and a heal that scaled purely off bonus health, was to say, hey, look, Unending Despair is for health stacking champions to have a good item in slot 2. Now, the concern I had, and I think this actually is founded, and is reinforced by what we see in player behavior, is that like a durability item with dual resist is an item that everyone's going to buy slot 2, even if it's not actually that good. And so, for example, Unending Despair is not actually that strong of an item for most users. Most people buying Unending Despair are actually kind of making a bad choice here. But the reason it has dual resist is actually kind of up here, serving Heartsteel champions, Warmog's champions, big, high health Mundo, Cho'Gath, Scion, etc. To be like, you have a very good feeling slot 2 item. In slot 1, you got no target resists. In slot 2, your build might be done because the game might be over before slot 3 is done. And high yield is actually true. And so we're just going to give you an item that just feels good in slot 2. It covers everything you need, and just like, congratulations, you can just go Heartsteel and Ending. You have a build that is for you that you can just go feel good about. And that is true, right? That actually was achieved. It totally feels good on these champions. Go Heartsteel and Ending, and you're like, I did it. I got the build, and I have exciting items that feel good for me. And that is good. Like, that is useful. The downside of that is Unending Despair is like, you're looking at the tank items, and you're like, what do I want to buy? F it, Unending Despair. Like, doesn't matter what I am, doesn't matter if I'm Sunfire Cape first, doesn't matter if I'm Leandry's first, doesn't matter what my first item is. You just buy this because, like, well, I look at the numbers and I'm like, I'm not gonna do the math, just buy it. And there are better items out there, but it's so sort of complete, even though it's actually not, because people don't do the math. It feels like the item is like, well, of course I just buy it. It's just perfect, even though it's not actually always true. I made a point there, but this is you can like this can cause you problems if you're not always careful, right? Next thing is talking about item comparisons. So the point here is there's two ways for me, basically. So one is items that are very clearly distinct are function like they're very distinct. Hey, Storm Surge and Horizon Focus don't have a lot of overlap. Yes, they are squishy ability power items with a good amount of AP on them. Yes, I see deal damage, but like, I buy Horizon Focus because it's got a lot of haste, and on live right now it's because it's explicitly locked to being an artillery champion. And Storm Surge says, I'm very bursty, and I want even more burst to make sure I can go kill the targets. The flat magic then helps sell that as well, and that kind of stuff there. But sometimes you have much more direct comparables. So, for example, all of the Lost Chapter upgrades, whether you're looking at Archangels, or Malignants, or Ludens, or Blackfire Torch, they are relatively similar in price point. They give a similar amount of mana. They give varying amounts of haste. They give varying amounts of ability power. They have very unique passives. And so basically you're saying, well, I need to look at the details of the text here to see which item is better for me. And I think that is functional, right? It is not just, oh, I'm trading 10 AP or 15 AP for 10 haste. I'm also trading out a burn for this proc here, and I'm trading out the other thing. Or, I went for Seraphs and I got the shield because I want the more durable item. And it's also got this nice binding to Rod of Ages because the mana from Roa is going to feed into Seraphs. And that probably means I want to be durable, and this all kind of feeds into itself and over again. The tough thing, and I don't have a great like pithy answer for you here, but the point of this line being here essentially is sorry, I'm just like trying to think how to phrase this properly. Item selection should be obvious when you can do that, and it's also okay for like there not to be real choices. So what I mean is like, hey, if you're trying to play a melee assassin, you're probably just getting Lichbane every game on slot 1. And then you're probably going Storm Surge slot 2, and you're probably going Shadow Flame slot 3. And that's fine. Again, the earlier point about going Heartsteel and Unending Despair, I think that is also totally fine. I think it is more important to have items that feel very, very good, even if they are kind of rote, than to have a set of choices that all feel kind of bad. 6 perfect items is a way better state than 12 mediocre items, none of which feel good. Yes, in the latter case, you have a lot more choice here, but you'd rather feel good about all your items, even if the build is kind of on rails. That's tended to be true for players. And I know this is true for the majority of players, because even when there is a substantial amount of build variety actually there and the data bears out there's a lot of options out there, people still just believe there's only one build. Like, by and large, the cultural zeitgeist is, oh, you've got to go, Divine Sunder is the only item you can go for. Actually, right now, you have to go Rod of Agents. Like, well, no, it's good, of course, especially situationally when you're against Burst, but like, no, actually, it's there's other good items that are totally fine here as well. So, sucks to suck, but that's kind of where it is. I know this has not been this point in particular, I've not been very good, like, I haven't been very, like, directed on, and apologies for that one. That's been kind of hazy moving around. End of the day, it's like, hey, people are kind of imperfect at making item comparisons, and so to me, making the comparisons stand out as strongly as you can, which often means stripping pieces out of the item to make the differences stronger, is helpful. Also, I guess one other thing I'll say is that anytime someone sees text that doesn't serve their champion, they are immediately turned off. So if you have, for example, an overly complex unique passive where they don't think they can meet the conditions every single time, they're just going to turn their brains off and be like, it's not for me. For the longest time, anytime Sheen or Trinity Force had mana on it, Shen players were like, absolutely never. I would never waste money on mana. And it's like, dude, if this item didn't have mana, and we just like deleted the line from the item, we literally nerfed the item for everyone else, and it'd still be good, by the way. Shen players would be like, oh, I should buy this. This is a pretty good item. Look at this. It gives attack speed and attack damage and health and ability haste and the Sheen proc off of my Q. Like, both old and new Shen both had pretty short Q cooldowns. It's like, you just change the perception of the item by like a massive degree. And it's one thing I've also come to notice with item changes is that opening an item to new users doesn't tend to immediately infatuate them in the way that current users who perfectly use the current version of a specific item are like, but the item's perfect for me and exactly me. This is the best item. You're nerfing it for me. And then for the other, 20 champions who could use this item well, they haven't thought of it yet. And so that's one of the interesting things that happens as well with like when people are thinking about shopping is that has a problem as well. The last point here is selecting targets. I talked about that already, which is a combination of like, we have a lot of data around actual item power and framework driven item power and survey data and actual player usage rates. And so at the end of the day, what it came down to is combined with the last patches of Nerf to Rod of Ages, we have nerfed 4 items that checked all the boxes of usage rate and survey data and model driven win rate and like model driven or framework driven like item power, actually. Doing a couple of adjustments that are going to be relatively power neutral. And then we're doing a bunch of buffs to items that, largely irrelevant of survey and usage data, satisfy our like quantitative power metrics of like Ludens is like the second, or I think it's the third most built AP item in the game, and survey data is roughly neutral, but through any of our statistical frameworks is like, now this item is actually pretty bad, so it's getting buffed. And things like that. Crypt Bloom is one where I'm actually really reticent to buff it. We're going to buff it anyway. I think Crypt Bloom is not a actually weak item, but it has completely no users. It pulls horribly in survey data, and yeah. So we'll see, but I do think that item's actually pretty good. Regardless, let's talk about, finally, the next point in the slide, which is not the items themselves. So let's talk about the AP class overview, and this is like the broad framework through which, again, champions are all unique snowflakes. Just because this is their class does not mean it's actually what the champion is truly doing individually. And the most important test is that, does a champion have a complete build? So to me, there are vaguely 5 classes of champion in the AP space. There's assassins / burst mages. So assassins are pretty much by definition melee. And burst mages are by definition range, but otherwise have very, very, very similar needs. It is high amounts of ability power. It is low appetite for haste. It is high appetite for magic penetration. The core difference is that assassins are given very, very strong tools. Burst mages to some degree as well, but not always the same. Assassins are given strong tools to reach the target they want to kill. Whereas burst mages, depending on who they are, don't always. So for example, I would argue both LeBlanc and Annie are burst mages. But LeBlanc has the tools to reach Jhin, Annie does not. And so in a world where Annie has like percent pen as a passive on her R, I think it's a defensible mechanic because Annie can't really choose to go reach Jhin. And a world where Burst Mage Annie is a balanced champion requires that she overkills Jhin by so much that there's never ever room for interaction, that she Astro overkills him, and then has like piddling okay-ish damage, I guess, against like your typical frontliner. Whereas LeBlanc doesn't need to have a bunch of target agnosticism in the way that we just gave it to Annie a month ago. LeBlanc is like, yeah, your skill test is figuring out how to reach the Jhin or the Jinx or the affiliates or whatever. You got to go figure that out. That is part of the skill of you playing your champion. Go deal with it. Because in a world where LeBlanc is good at killing Maokai, the game breaks down. Because who's good into LeBlanc now? Hope you have Mal's ult? That's not enough. And so having a set of targets and target access in mind is important. And then using that through then the lens of, are you repeatable? Are you not? And look, if LeBlanc wants to like pivot her build because like actually this entire team is tanky and I can't burst anyone, and so I'm gonna have a worse time, but I'm gonna play a haste build and I'm gonna like try to burn this tank down with Leandries, and it's gonna be a worse use of LeBlanc. It's gonna be a weaker than if it was an ideal comp for her, but like it is good that champion classes and champions individually have generic strengths and weaknesses where it's like, yeah, it kind of sucks to be a burst champion if you're against 4 bruisers and tanks. Or an assassin, at least like the assassin skewed types of these. And it would be a reason on Akali to say, I'm going to play for the Conqueror Riftmaker version and not the electrocute, high AP Lichbane stuff. And like, you make that pivot. You move towards fighter when you're allowed to as Akali or Echo or whatever. And like, that's fine. You become a fighter because the game dictates it, not because as an assassin, you can just also assassinate frontline. The next class down, which is similarly squishy, is artillery mages. There aren't a whole lot of them. In fact, you would the case I would make here is that Zoe is a burst mage, not artillery mage. But again, it's not a, hard, rigid box here. It's just, I think she's more of a burst champion than artillery, but obviously she has some poke aspects, right? In the way that Akali is an assassin, but also clearly has some fighter aspects. Echo is a fighter with some assassin aspects. Diana is a fighter with some assassin aspects. But the point is, for artillery mages have actually a lot of space here. They should be, by default, squishy. They are the default squishiest AP class in the game. They don't have high base stats. They are meant to be safe by playing from long range. They should have high access to ability power, high amounts of ability power. They should have high access to amounts of ability haste so that they can choose to play high uptime artillery. They're also, situationally, totally fine to play high burst ability power. High burst or high uptime ability power. Either one is fine, more or less, but we want to make sure both avenues are good, and so that allows us to do things like, hey, let's make sure that the mana costs are reasonable such that you can move on and play Horizon Focus. One thing that I identified here as part of this is like, oh, I don't really like that Ziggs has to go 2 Lost Chapter items. I don't know if we'll do it this patch, but the fact that Ziggs kind of has to go Seraphs because of the mana pool means that Ziggs doesn't get to be highly lethal, highly damaging, and appropriately squishy because he has a 500-point shield in all of his builds. Because his actual build is like Blackfire Torch or Ludens and a Seraph's Embrace. And then he finally gets to build a cool item on slot 3. It's like, that's too late. And so like we'll probably at some point go and change Ziggs' mana costs / mana pool to make sure he's happy on like just a Blackfire Torch and functional. And if he wants to really greed a bunch of mana, he can, but I don't know why he probably would. But if he wants to pick Seraphs over Horizon Focus because he really wants the shield because there's a Talon and a Vi on the enemy team, okay, right, that's totally fine. That's totally reasonable. It is fine to situationally go into durability when there's assassins. That's fine. But if the default look for Ziggs is, oh, I always get a 500-point Seraph's shield because he needs the mana, oops. Things are slightly off, right? And having this like framework driven, like let's go top down, like let's make sure we're doing all the right things, like, oh yeah, that's an identified problem that like we should probably fix, right? But again, artillery mages, default to squishy, high AP, high haste, can choose to build burst if they want to. Next one down the line, control mages. This is, you're pretty much your standard Orianna. This is where Syndra kind of is. Yes, she looks a little bit like a burst champion, but this is like when you think of a default mage in League of Legends, probably what you're thinking of. This now says, hey, sometimes I'm going to be looking a little bit more towards durability because I'm not playing at maximum range, but like across all the other AP champs in the game, I'm probably still the second squishiest class. Nerfs is a little bit more reasonable. Rite of Ages, kind of weird. Should be very able to and willing to build full squishy, high AP every slot. Realistically, control mage builds and control mage builds are going to be almost identical, is the idea here. And it's why, again, one of the passes getting deleted off Horizon Focus, because Orianna and Victor and Hui should all feel good about buying Horizon Focus. They should have a clear path to high ability haste in every slot. If your build is Blackfire Torch into Horizon Focus and cooldown boots and Crypt Bloom, and now you want to round out with a Death Cap, that should be a viable build path where you're like, no, I'm going haste every slot, and if I really, 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 really want haste, fine. Cosmic Drive is another 25 haste item for me, if you really, really care that much. But for the most part, like, let's give them the full AP builds with Storm Surge and Shadow Flame in there. Let's give them the full haste builds with and Void Staff. Let's give them the full haste builds with Horizon Focus and cooldown boots and Crypt Bloom, and like make sure that both of those paths are there, because you're like, I'm playing control mage, and you know what? No one on that team is burstable. Okay, well, we make sure that your base damages and ability power ratios are such that it is reasonable to trade off Void Staff versus Void Staff versus Crypt Bloom. It is reasonable to trade off Shadow Flame versus Horizon Focus or Storm Surge versus Horizon Focus. Let's make sure the numbers make sense, that the 25 AP I'm trading for 20 haste is acceptable, and that is fine. It's like, well, let's make sure your AP ratios are appropriate then, because I know gold-wise what that costs, but if your kit says, actually, I have astronomically high AP ratios, and my mana pool is so constrained that if I build haste, I run out of mana, we should fix that, right? And so, again, I truly believe there's going to be some champion kit follow-up work, just moving numbers around to make sure that they have the appropriate affinity for these items. But this work is making sure those items are in the spot that we think is reasonable. Next step down is battle mages. This is Swain, Cassiopeia, Rise, I would argue Brand are all in the space as well, where and Brand, you could argue, is again jumping back towards Burst Mage sometimes because he kind of offloads and leaves, but there's totally like viable battle mage builds out there for Brand. The point is, you are now doing 80 carry things. You are constantly in range all the time. Your stuff often only has like 700 range or so, and we're expecting you to literally just stay in combat. Again, Rise and Cassiopeia being really, really obvious examples of this. Swain being a really obvious example of this, where it's like, no, you are staying in range. It's not like a Kennen thing where you're like, I dive in once, hope they all die, and then I can do whatever. It's like, no, you are staying in range to do your job. You don't really go in and out. Okay, well, guess what? These champs need to live long enough when Veigar and Syndra are in the game such that they can get through. Like the idea that, like, yes, Swain might get outranged by Syndra, but he's not getting one shot by Syndra. He's actually allowed to do his job in a team fight if Syndra exists. In the way that any champion is to play at that kind of range is allowed to exist and play the game out when Syndra exists. She can zone, she can CC, she can peel, she can help get a kill if it's a 2v1 or set up a gank or whatever. And I'm not saying like Swain should actually counter Syndra XD, but it's like, no, your champion should function. So let's give you the kit that makes sure that you function. Let's make sure the overall damage tuning in League of Legends, like across the game overall, is such that you don't tend to get bursted out when you're playing a battle mage and you're exposing yourself to the entire enemy team being in range of you. And let's make sure that the items that serve you, such that if we're going to have, gold snowballing modulate how well the game goes, okay, well, Syndra's really far ahead of Swain. Swain something like this one shot, or like gets comboed out and can't actually team fight. Swain gets really ahead, he gets a shrug off Syndra. Yeah, that dance is appropriate for League of Legends to have texture based on what you're doing. That is appropriate. So battle mages have a meaningful appetite for durability such that they are not burstable. They can be brought down, not burstable. And then the final one is just truly the actual fighters and occasionally greedy tanks. Amumu and Zac will go for a Leandri's Torment sometimes, and they are allowed to build greedier. They are allowed to go for these kinds of builds. They want to go into Riftmaker. They want to go into Bloodletter's Curse because they're doing well and they want to carry. I am fine with tanks having viable AP alt builds for when they are snowballing. I think we should make sure that these champions are good as tank builds from the beginning. Some of these really hard affinities, like W with Leandri's, is really hard to break out, and so he's kind of going to be on the item for a long time, but when is reasonable, have it be an alt build, not the default. I do want to do a project at some point of bringing down some tank burst damage to make sure that they're not too threatening overall, because in a lot of cases they can be. Um, but this is, the kind of situation where, okay, they really are. They are melee, they are running in, and they don't have a Kali Shroud, they don't have Echo R, they don't have Evelyn R. They can't just get out. They're in, and they're staying in. Mordekaiser is staying in. Singed, like, has to literally touch people with his body basically to deal damage, and then he's gonna fling and run away. Sure, yeah, but like he needs to like have the durability to like actually play his champion out, because he can't blink. They don't get in very quickly. And of course there is a wide variety of fighters here, right? From true juggernauts like Mordekaiser to very, lithe and deft ones such as Echo, who can literally just blink black out. And like, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if Echo does some assassin builds, because of course he can. He has R. That's an assassin spell basically. But he also has his W and his passive, his W passive that says, actually, I've got some fighter patterns here where I'm going to stick in with it. I might go Rocket Belt. I might go Cosmic Drive. I might get some durability on these slots and stick around a bit longer. All right, so finally, I know we're 45 minutes in. We're not even on the items yet, but I wanted to kind of, here's the groundwork that we're kind of working off of to look at these items and make changes. So here we go. We are nerfing the 3 of the best AP items. Rod of Ages was nerfed by 5 ability power and 50 health last patch. Again, it was pretty clearly an overpowered item. Seraph's Embrace losing 20% of its shield. Essentially, we think that with the changes coming in this patch, that there will be plenty of fruitful and useful battle mage and fighter durable enough items such that Seraph's can lose some of its shield and not give quite as much durability to a whole squad of control mages who are really mana hungry and whatnot. And we can just ensure, like down the line, that Kassadin or Ryze or whoever else, Cassiopeia, etc., have enough durability that they're going to be okay with the shield being weaker. Landry's Torment, what it comes down to is this should not be a default item. This should be an item that is situationally good, that is worth trading off meaningful AP and meaningful ability haste in order to gain this percent max health burn damage. I've certainly seen the comments of like, but Riot, we're buying this because champions are too tanky. So my view right now is that overall in League of Legends, champions are not too tanky. Now, certainly the current invasion of a bunch of Roa, Riftmaker, Roa, Liandry's mid laners is making a lot of squishy mages too tanky, and now there's an arm race of like, well, I can't burst you, so why would I go for a burst build? You're just going to build that item. Well, of course, if Liandry's is OP and Roa's OP, why would you not build the best items, which also happens to counter the burst mage that you're up against in lane, right? Of course. Why would they ever do anything else? Because not only they get to counter you, it's also they're just the strongest item in the game. If they're not the strongest item in the game, well, guess what? You as the burst mage could go burst the other champion, all the other AP users who are doing this already. And the AP bot laners and AP supports occasionally who are doing this as well. Even some of the AP junglers, right? It's like, well, yeah, if everyone's already building health, yeah, you can't do your job anymore. So part of the reason AP burst builds kind of suck is, one, the relative power of AP burst items to AP health items is off, and then two, the meta game that you're in is a bunch of AP health items, aka you can't burst them. Now, in general, though, the fact that fighters aren't good at aren't getting bursted very easily and tanks are getting bursted very easily, that is working as intended. Again, broadly speaking, the overall combat pacing of League, I think, is fine right now. We have robust player surveys around how people feel about combat pacing. It varies by server, and it will vary over time to a certain degree, of course. But the global aggregate answer here is that the people who think combat is too fast and those who think combat is too slow are in equivalence. Now, we might decide down the line that the best version of League is one where the majority of players think combat's too fast by a small degree. But for now, I'm inclined to think that the overall pace of combat in League of Legends is appropriate, that on average, champions are appropriately tanky, and that when you face tankier champions, such as Juggernauts and tanks, they in fact feel very tanky, and that you're like, wow, I'm against a Darius. I can't burst him. Good is kind of what I can say here. Like, that is intended. It is intended that when you're playing Syndra, interacting with Darius is meaningfully different from interacting with Ahri, is meaningfully different from interacting with Jhin. And of course, Ahri's currently going Roa, Riftmaker, Liandry, so she looks like Darius. That is a problem that we are fixing by nerfing those items, because that's not the experience you signed up for when you played Syndra into Ahri. So we got to fix that. Again, the item tuning is not appropriate. But when you're saying, hey, should I build Liandry's game? It's like, well, we're in a game where actually everyone's a tank and I do not have burst targets. okay, I'm going to go for a drainier build. I'm going to go for a slower build. I'm going to go for a burn-based build because this game does not behoove a burstier build. Cool. We make the trade-off high enough that Leanders isn't generically the best item in the game, which it has been for months, which has metagame effects of when everyone finally realizes that. Now the matchups are also not burstable, but again, we get to the point where Leandries should be an actual trade-off, and that as a burst mage, if you have a hard time with Darius, good. That's intended. Final change here is Blackfire Torch. It's a pretty small nerf, but it is one that adds in the list as well. It's, not a big deal, but it's a, 4% or so cost increase. So item is overall nerfed here. And so, yeah, we are nerfing the basically long duration fight items a small amount as they're all overperforming. They are a bit overpowered. The Blackfire Torch change is likely to be different. It'll be something else tomorrow. You'll see it on the Friday PBE. But it'll be probably a shift around to make the combat power of the item feel better without actually making the item any stronger. The goal is still to nerf Blackfire Torch a small amount. We then go to roughly power neutral adjustments. Lichbane is losing 15 ability power, but is getting 300 gold cheaper, and the build path is getting, to be fair, buffed from an NLR to a blasting one. This makes the item 2,900 gold. And actually, one thing I didn't talk about when I talked about class reviews is not only am I talking about stat affinity and sort of how the champions are going to function, I want to talk about actual game time pacing here. So the thing I want to bring up is, and this is to be clear, as much or more about actual kit tuning than it is about item tuning itself, although we can ladder into it pretty easily with items. So the goal with assassins and burst champions overall is to generally, on average, but not always, every champ is a unicorn, every champ is unique, but generally on average, these champs should be more early game skewed and snowbally against the average class of champions in their role. That as an assassin, you are good at killing an individual champion, which means when you're in a 1v1 lane, that is a clear and obvious point of strength. And that when the game gets grouped up and you start going towards 30-minute Baron team fights and whatever, it is naturally going to be harder to be an assassin. And so we can, of course, in some cases, give assassins really, really good late game tools to allow them to still team fight well when doing so. Oftentimes that can make them look a bit like fighters. Akali is an example here of an assassin who actually has a pretty real late game because she has the tools to team fight effectively. But on average, you look at what LeBlanc does. It's like, yeah, LeBlanc runs the game for a while and then is pressured to close the game. It is good that champions have different power curves and that some champions are pressured to close the game out in time and some opponents are on the back foot and have to lick their wounds and wait and hope that they can recover from mistake or group up in time or make the right plays to catch somebody out or whatever and get back out from under an assassin. And so on average, burstier items are meant to be cheaper. Champions who buy bursty items are meant to spike a little bit sooner. And on average, though not in all cases, these types of champions are meant to be a bit early game skewed from kit function. This could be through kit tuning. This could be through the types of tools that they have. Again, a Kali W is a way to team fight later on. It's a cute way to gain some energy in lane. It's a team fight godsend late game, right? That's like the big one to bring up. Otherwise, the general one is going to be, hey, team fight focused mages kind of around here are going to look towards more 2 to 3 items, right? The average game of League of Legends ends around the time your third item is done, which means the game is often decided before the third item is done. And so the general rough space here is for a lot of these sort of middle ground mages, they're going to be roughly 2 item spike champions. And a lot of that's going to be your second max is also really good. And so you really want to have level 13. Your ultimate has meaningful rank ups. That rank 2 ult is good. And so you're really happy there. And then understanding that when you get towards 3 to 4 items, well, the multiplicative nature of critical strike chance takes the conventional crit auto attack 80 carries and puts them over the top later on. And there's the tension around, can you catch them out? Can you burst them? Can they dodge from the assassins? Whatever. And you've got some interesting class dynamics going back and forth. Where it's like, well, it doesn't matter how fed Jhin is. Fed LeBlanc will always kill him in one combo. Even if Jhin is theoretically better late game than LeBlanc, if LeBlanc one-shots him, her team wins the team fight. And so you have, fun interactions there. And again, I think it is good that all champs can't do everything, to try to carve out more strong niches per champion and say, you have an express purpose. You've got to do your job well here. You're going to be good at this thing. And so I think overall League has moved slightly toward homogenizing. I know I have individually contributed to that and I regret some of what I've done there. But I would like to slightly resharpen champions over time. One way to do that is, again, to be fairly particular around item spike timing and things like that. Broadly, but like not, super harsh by every single slot. Okay, so those are the nerfed items. Let's talk about power neutral adjustments. Well, with the line being, hey, assassins should tend to spike pretty early, and if you're really good early on, Lichbane is getting gold efficiency wise is pretty neutral. It's losing, 300 something gold with ability power. It's getting 300 gold cheaper. That's going to tend to be power neutral overall. Obviously, spiking sooner is something that feels good for champions like this. It's interesting. There's some chance, and we should like serve the audience correctly and fit, player needs. The champs who want to buy a Lichbane typically want to spike early. Here's a better early spike. The champs who want, big, large spells tend to want bigger items with more ability power and stats on them, and that's kind of happening a little bit here as well. There are a lot of build path updates here. It's in a lot of cases pushing Fiendish Codex in instead of Kindle Gem in a lot of these spots. Basically, if you're getting ability haste on a mage item, you should almost always be able to find it from a Codex. Some of them don't have it, and you've got to build it from the last chapter, but for the most part, it's trying to put Codex on all these so that you can... there's like a little bit of easier window shopping. And I think this also fits the item better in that Kindle Gem is already serving a different audience in the first place, and so it helps kind of alleviate some of the load around epic items here. Strict buffs. These are things that you really can't consider in any other way than it's strictly stronger. Bloodletter's Curse does, in fact, kind of suck. 5 ability power, 50 health, and the shred is going to be 7.5% per stack, 4 stacks for 30% shred. So it's still on 4 hits, but it's saying, hey, when we look at something like Black Cleaver, where champions have physical damage spells and every auto attack always applies it, Bloodletter's Curse champions are not always going to be applying it nearly as quickly. And so, hey, if we assume you're kind of locked behind using spells and whatnot, let's move this down and say it's going to shred 50% faster. It only takes 4 stacks. This item's going to be online for you. Obviously, a strict stat upgrade here as well. This is probably the single biggest buff this patch. It's a really big deal. But yeah, Bloodletters fails every metric. It fails user base. It fails survey. It fails any, like, both versions of item quantifying. The item's not very good. Nashor's Tooth very lightly fails. It's not terribly weak, but we think we can push Nashor's Tooth up a little bit here. It's already on the slightly cheap side, if I recall correctly. I think its stat profile is already kind of fine. Just like, you know what? We have room to say that the aggressive item is cheaper because the aggressive item should be a little cheaper. Merlinomicon, I'm not sure if my notes were wrong from earlier or what, but Merlinomicon is 100 gold more expensive than I thought it was supposed to be. So this might have been a mistake for me, and I never caught it ever since 4.19 or 14.19. That's entirely a possibility. But like on my document, Merlinomicon that like I tuned it for was 2850. But it's 2950, and like shows how much I build Merlinomicon. For what it's worth, there's 2 things I want to say here. So one, the item is weak, right? And dropping about 100 gold, I think is relatively appropriate. The other though is that it is not intended that you finish Chempunk Chainsword or Merlinomicon. You are meant to build Executioner's Calling or Oblivion Orb, and then sit there and buy your other items, and then when you hit full build, so that the item is not dead in your inventory, finish the upgrade. It is why Chempunk Chainsword has a good amount of health on it. This has to serve Grievous Wounds needs for assassins all the way up to like full-on heavy juggernauts, and even maybe though, kind of an argument here, AD tanks like Scion, if they want to proactively apply Grievous Wounds. And so because it has to serve a very wide array of champions, and you actually could argue that, like, screw it, and Assassin's going to go ahead and build Mortal Reminder instead, which, yeah, I could see that. But because it has to serve, like, that big, wide array of champions, it's got to be relatively beefy, because it has to be not griefing for Darius to buy this and then finish the item later when he's fighting Volibear or Mundo or whatever. And on the same side, Merlinomicon has to serve Mordekaiser and Xerath, and they have incredibly different needs. But it means the item does need health, because Mordekaiser should be allowed to build Oblivion Orb and then feel okay about finishing the build with a mature build that is like not griefing and made of paper. I think being able to democratize out this stat and saying, yes, everyone more or less has access to this stat is fine, is encouraged, but it should not be necessarily correct to say, I've got Oblivion, oh, I must go finish Morelos. It's like, no, you're allowed to take a 800 gold pit stop to buy Oblivion, and then, like, just go build your Horizon Focus, or whatever you're going to build. And so, like, there is a cap to how efficient Merlinomicon and items like this should be, because it is not meant to sidetrack your build. It's meant to be a pit stop, and you finish your build. But again, the item is like pretty clearly a trap, and so a small buff here. Keep in mind that a cheaper item getting minus 100 gold is a bigger buff than a larger item getting minus 100 gold. Rabbidan's Death Cap is, I would say, only slightly weak. And what's funny is when I initially did the list of buffs here, Rabbidan's one of the only like strict buffs here to items that were like kind of borderline, and it was meant to be like, hey, those high AP builds are gonna feel better with cheaper, easier to build Death Cap. And over time, basically went in and like threw in a lot more buffs. The one concern I have here is that this overall set of changes is a pretty large, like, sweeping buff to mages, especially because some of these items are actually overbuffed here. I don't think Death Cap minus 100 gold is like a really big deal, but we'll talk about them later. Like, there are some that I think are actually just kind of overbuffed, and it's like kind of, it makes me a little bit uneasy because I don't want to power creep the game if I can help it. The fact that there are 4 buffs and like, or sorry, 4 nerfs and like 9 buffs is, you know, part of that. And so, though, again, most of these buffs are like very defensible, and it's like not like build that is in the game right now. And Merlin Icons like not really in the game right now, right? So like these are buffs, but they're currently not, you know, expressing themselves in the game anyway. Luden's Companion is by data, by all the objective metrics, is underpowered through usage rate and through like player survey. It's quite common. It actually gets more nerf requests than buff requests. Not again that it's binding by any mean, but it's like worth noting that like the players we ask about items tend to think that Luden's is on the strong side, relative to other mage items in particular. Regardless, though, this item does look quite weak, and we're saying, hey, again, the lens is let's give bursty champions the earlier spikes. Minus gold is like the direct way to do that, right? It is first order. This item is only a little bit weak. It's not a ton weak. Again, I really think that most of the AP system is pretty close together overall. I think it's pretty close to balanced overall, but hey, there's a move we can make here. Let's make that move. Malignance, a 5 ability power buff is pretty equivalent to this here. It's, again, a relatively weak item. Let's make it a little bit better. Again, it's not absurdly off. We already know this item is relatively hard bound to certain kits there, so it's never going to be all that popular. We should throw those champions well and make sure they feel good about it, and so there's the buff. We then have adjustments that are meant to be power positive, and so we're going to go through these. They're going to be, a little bit more meaningful here. So Horizon Focus. The conditional 10% damage amp on hitting somebody from beyond 600 units is removed. In its stead is 35 ability power and a 200 gold price increase. Now, obviously, if you're already currently a very, very good Horizon Focus user, this is a nerf for you in some contexts. Now, what's interesting, though, and it's why I like having a fairly rigorous item, like, mathematical tuning framework, is it lets me look at this and say, like, well, look, I have a model, I have a belief on what the gold value of the damage amp is, which is only against champions, so it's not as good as AP per damage, and 2, is not always on. It is totally possible that you're playing Vel'Koz or Xerath or something, and the Yone ults you, or the Talon jumps a wall, and you might see the item and be like, I do 10% more damage. It's like, no, you do 10% more damage 80% of the time, only to champions. And that is a meaningful distinction that matters, because this is one of the cases where, because the condition says you must be long ranged, there's a whole bunch of relatively long range mages that don't think this item can be bought. So Orianna and Victor and all these champions, even though they probably could use the item reasonably well, probably, I'm not saying like super easy, are no longer willing to look at the high haste, high AP stat stick that would totally serve a reasonable high haste build. But there's a line of text that says, well, but I'm not always going to range away, so I will never buy this item because it might not work. And on the other side, you've got, your Vel'Koz and Xerath who are like, this unique is literally always on, and it's the best thing ever, and it's perfect. And if that were actually true, this item would already be astronomically overpowered. Like, if you really considered Hypershot's damage amp to be just 10% more damage flat, this is the single strongest AP item in the game, and it is not close. And yet, player usage rate data suggests that's not true. Player survey data suggests that is not true. Win rate data suggests that is not true. And the model that I use, which says this is not always on and it's only its champion, says, yeah, of course it's not true. And the end result is Horizon Focus is slightly underpowered on its current users, which it is. Because, again, this doesn't affect minions, and it's not always on. And so trading out 10% damage for 35 AP is a very, very, very large upgrade. Now, in some cases, I could totally see a Xerath or a Vel'Koz lose some win rate, because if the exact best user get good value out of this one, okay, fine, right? But even then, I'm not even convinced. Even then, I'm not convinced that it's actually just like clearly better than Storm Surge or Shadow Flame or something, and people are just believing it's just 10% unconditional damage, which is not true. So what it comes down to is, I think 35 AP is much, much stronger than Hypershot, such that this item also warrants a 200 gold increase. Now, this means the item is still cheaper than Cosmic Drive. It gives the same amount of ability haste as Cosmic Drive, and it gives, I want to say, 40 or 50 more ability power than Cosmic Drive. Cosmic Drive gives some move speed and some health. I know a lot of champions who will trade some health and a little bit of move speed, okay, moderate amount of move speed, for like 40 ability power and 100 gold. There's a lot of champions who are like, yeah, of course I want to build that way. All the Arya players who are pissed that they have to go Roa into Leandries and Riftmaker. Yeah, of course. This item is for you to say, you want to repeat? Awesome, have fun. You want to be more damaging as Syndra? Awesome, here you go. You are going to frag people with 40 more ability power and another 100 gold in your pocket. And yes, this means that unique passive is reveal champs you hit at long range and like trigger Scry's Loom sometimes every 30 seconds. Okay, cool. There's like some cute flavor here, which is like mostly flavor, that I think will not turn players off. What they're going to see is 110 ability power on an item for less than 3,000 gold with 25 haste and go, wow, that's a lot of stats. I want ability power and ability haste. This item's for me. And I think, again, the item serving a bunch of users is more important than like, but it's called Horizon Focus. It's the artillery item. It's like, well, it's the high AP, high haste item, because it should serve a whole bunch more champions, because we can delete one line of text, buff another line of text, and triple user base. To me, that is worth it. To me, that is the right choice to do for this item. Next is Hextech Rocket Belt. I know you've seen a different iteration on the PBE. The current version is this. It is plus 10 ability power, which goes up to 70. It is plus 5 ability haste, going up to 20. It is minus 50 health, going down to 300 health from 350, and it's 50 gold more expensive. This ends up being, on net, for me, about a 6% buff to the item. The item is 6% more stats per gold, functionally. And we're basically trying to... It's basically a shift here. So the Rocket Belt that's on live and the Rocket Belt that was on PBE ended up being like 2-to-1 damage to durability, with like obviously some parts are here for utility of the dash, but 2-to-1 damage to durability is much too heavy for the user base we're looking for. And so by cutting down on health and bumping two of the damage stats here, we're gonna get closer to like 3-to-1 damage to durability, which like that's a framing I think is actually really valuable to think about. And it's one that again is like built into the model. Every time I update an item, it just literally spits out like what's the ratio of stat bracketing. And Rocket Belt being 3-to-1 says, okay, it's a little bit tanky for assassins, right? 300 health is not exactly the stat line Evelyn wants, but like she can put up with it if she really wants to target access. And like 80 AP is, or 70 AP, 70 is like not miserable, right? That's like decent. It's not, again, Lichbane numbers, it's not Storm Surge numbers, it's not Shadow Flame numbers, but like it's enough to feel okay. But it means like, yeah, if you buy this on Evelyn, you are trading off some obvious damage because you're not going to scale all your abilities to the other 30 your ability power or the 15 magic pen or whatever, but you're getting target access. If that's worth it for you, awesome. You're getting some repeatability. You're getting a little bit of durability in case you like really can't play it this way. Okay, fine. You're playing Echo and you're like, I'm going to do less burst damage, but you know what? Instead of going Lichbane and trying to get the one shot with, a cheap version of 100 ability power and a really, really good active effect that's going to do, hundreds of damage every time. I want better target access. I want more repeatability. I want some durability. Woo me, I'm a fighter. Get me in here. I'll spend 300 gold. I'll spend 2650 on 300 health and like decent damage. And still, while still being a stat profile that like Kennan's fine with, Nico's fine with, Fiddlesticks is fine with, and so trying to like, okay, what is the numbers tuning such that we can woo fighters? It might be a little bit too frail for Juggernaut, so Mordekaiser might not really be the happiest with Rocket Belt. Okay, fine. But saying, you know what, we're gonna move it toward this way. And honestly, yeah, Rocket Belt was a little bit too Juggernaut skewed, and so moving it back toward like kind of skirmisher shaping. And that same like 3-to-1, 2-to-1, whatever sort of profiling, like I use that with the fight items as well to make sure that like skirmishers and divers and juggernauts also kind of felt like appropriately covered by the items they're using. And that's why we have these like 500 health items, because like, yeah, I said if you're going to play a really heavy juggernaut build, you're going to spend half your gold on damage and half your gold on durability, or like 60-40 damage to durability, and like you're going to feel heavy as a result. You're going to be really tanky and really hard to push down. they can tax your damage as needed, but that was the goal here. Storm Surge, this one might look scary. I truly believe this is win rate positive. If we get it wrong, of course we can make changes and just like buff the item. But this is like, hey, this is my good faith effort at lightly power positive adjustments, that if I'm wrong, we can just buff the item, right? If I'm wrong for a patch, we'll know from data and we just buff the item, right? So if I'm wrong, we buff the item. I understand the Sticker Shock here probably looks quite bad. Storm Surge is getting 2% flat move speed at all times, so going from 4% to 6%. It is getting 100 gold cheaper. Those are the buffs. That's obviously a pretty meaningful buff, right? That's a much better item. Storm Surge is already relatively popular. It is one of the least underpowered items from data. So I think Storm Surge doesn't really need very much. And so this is actually the smallest buff on paper from my analysis. But we are removing some text from the item to make it easier to understand, easier to appreciate, and able to front load the item more and make its direct comparison against other assassin items and against Shadow Flames in particular more direct. So this means the gold difference between Storm Surge and Shadow Flame is 400. That is meaningful enough to be really, again, yeah, repeating it, meaningful. Needlessly Large Rod versus Ether Wisp is a meaningful, it's the same, but is a meaningful difference in the build path. Says that you know why you're getting this. Storm Surge, by giving proactive move speed instead, says, right, I'm going to buy this to go kill other people. Instead of them both having some kind of aqueous in combat effect that makes you more effective, and they still do, right? One has a damage proc, one has this this like damage, more damage when they're low. Storm Surge has a condition around your combo being proactive and bursty in the way that like Zyra won't go Storm Surge, but she will go for Shadow Flame because it'll make her like Leandry's burn and plants better if she wants flat pen somewhere. Storm Surge says you need to be a bursty champion, so that's 1 point of comparison. Second point of comparison, again, a 400 gold delta, big enough to be meaningful. The final one being, again, flat proactive move speed says, oh, this is good enough that I can roam with this item and go elsewhere and do good things with this. I'm going to go kill bot lane. I buy Storm Surge because I'm going to go down there. And in fact, I'm going to buy Storm Surge over Rocket Belt or over Lich Bane because actually it's even faster than Lich Bane. I'm going to get there even sooner, and I'm going to get, maybe I don't auto attack very much in this pattern or whatever, or I can't use Lich Bane for some other reason. I'm going to get Storm Surge and I'm going to be fast. And then removing some text to be like, okay, well, part of the power budget of Storm Surge is this in-combat short duration move speed that you might be still casting other spells during, and so it often goes to waste. Just in a lot of cases, you often don't need Storm Surge. If you need the move speed, like the big move speed trigger, you already have things like Phase Rush. In a world where like champions kind of do move too fast, I think 2% unconditional move speed in terms of like the game feeling too fast is like more palatable than a surge of move speed sometimes. And again, what I believe to be, and then this conditional 30 gold is like, if you overkill someone and the thing explodes, you're still exploding in an AoE. Like, yeah, you might have wasted the proc if no one else is there, but like, this is just text that kind of doesn't need to be there. Again, if we can remove complexity, it's helpful. And just like, look, this is not doing a lot of heavy lifting. It's not doing anything to tell you who it's for. It's just text. I am a very big fan of trying to remove things that are truly just text and don't do anything to really sell the item very well. Like, if it was a collector and it said every takedown is 25 gold, I would feel differently. Oh, I get it. I'm buying this as a kind of a snowball item. Now, that said, mages have Magi's. They have a snowball item. Just buy a Dark Seal. So even then, like, I'm not even a huge fan of like, oh, there are snowball mage items because they literally have one expressly for that purpose. And the more you make other snowball mage items, you just eat away at Magi's purpose, and that's not great either. So a random thing there, but yeah, these things are going down. These things are getting buffed. I believe this is power positive, and again, if this is incorrect and this item is bad, we buff its AP, we buff the percent move speed or something, we make the item better. We'll just do that next. The last one is Crypt Bloom. I truly do believe Crypt Bloom has a PR problem, not an actual power level problem. But Crypt Bloom does not look good compared to Void Staff. It is only 150 gold cheaper. That is not enough to be like, oh man, I really just got to finish this. Because a lot of the time it's like, okay, well, I've got my Blighting Jewel. And it's like, well, next recall, I can buy Blasting Wand or Codex. By the way, they cost the same amount of gold, which means you're probably choosing, farther down the line, which one you're going to buy. It is a little bit unlikely that you recall off of just Blighting Jewel and have exactly enough gold for Crypt Bloom and go, the Baron fights right now, I guess I buy Crypt Bloom. That's not realistic. And so the first order is like, make the price the same, yes, you're going to like still choose on the second component which you're going to build, but at least the direct comparison is going to be a lot closer. So plus 150 gold. Okay, fine. We're giving it 5% more pen. So now it's 35 to 40. It's a much more, it's a sort of much more reasonable trade-off there. Like, okay, I'm only losing 5% pen. I can stomach that. It's okay. Whereas I think 30 versus 40 is like a big enough downgrade. You're like, but I'm buying this for the pen. It's why I want this slot. The tough thing with Crypt Bloom, by the way, is like Crypt Bloom has a lot of text on it. Crypt Bloom has ability haste that Void Staff doesn't, and it has this life from death heal that Void Staff doesn't. And you have to pay for those, right? You can't just have Crypt Bloom be the best item because then Void Staff has no users, right? Like this has to be a balanced item. Otherwise, you just delete Void Staff, and you're no longer allowed to play a burst, but you've got to play haste on this slot. You've got to play haste on slot 3, slot 4. And so it's like, well, how can we get as close as we can to not feeling the sticker shock? It's like, well, let's bring the AP up from 60 to 75. Okay, 75 AP versus 95 AP. It's like, well, I'm trading off 20 AP for 20 haste. I'm cool with that, right? I actually think the balanced version of Crypt Bloom is actually 70 AP, not 75. But because no one thinks the item is good, even though I think it actually is fine, this is the one item that I think is actually targeted at overpowered. I think Crypt Bloom is overpowered in this patch because no one thinks it's good, even if it is, which means we have to overshoot to swing perception. And then I am very willing to nerf some things down once that has been met, which I think is going to be needed at some point here. I do think this system is a little bit overtuned as a result, but let's get the player base where we need to go. So 75 AP, right? You're losing 20 AP for 20 haste. You're losing 5 pen. And as compensation for that 5 pen, like versus Void Staff, you still have life from death. And I think that is a comparison you can make and be like, this feels acceptable. 75 AP does not feel like a meme, whereas 60 does. I think 35% magic pen is enough to like feel reasonable and like you're actually getting some value. And so the way to make room for that, because this is obviously a very, very large buff, is again 150 more gold, so it's tied with Void Staff. I think the direct comparison is fair. Again, I think small, like fiddly numbers differences are not good enough for item comparison. Like, 400 gold on Storm Surge versus 400 gold on Storm Surge versus Shadow Flame is. I think the meaningful disparity between Lichbane and Rocket Belt, or Ludens and Blackfire Torch, I think those totally are. Those totally meet the bar. 150 gold is not. The other change, though, is to make room, nerfing the heal by about 30%. So this is bringing the base heal down from 100 to 75. It's bringing the AP ratio down from 25% to 10%. Now, I basically ballparked Crypt Bloom at 3 items. I think a lot of times people buy pen is on slot 3. Most, again, games end on slot 3. And so at a 300 AP build, which is a roughly 3 slot build, that is 30% less healing. Now, of course, if you go into slot 4, slot 5, that is a bigger nerf, sure. But one thing I think is also true for people who would look at this item is look at it and go like, well, I don't want to buy a support item. You look at the stats and you're like, 20 ability power, that sucks. 10% less pen, that sucks. It's basically the same price point. I'm buying the thing to heal my teammates, no thanks. And so I think we should have the power that, passive be good enough to like still exist on the item. And I think like a 100-something point heal to your entire team once per team fight is that. I think that's actually still a pretty good item. It's a pretty good effect that like has real value. But what it comes down to is let's grow the rest of the numbers up to not look terrible by comparison. And then as a result, land on, a lower healing to make room for the actual item's power budget while still like existing as text. And I believe that is everything. That is an hour and almost 20 minutes talking about AP items, why we made the changes we made, where we got to where we're going, and the champions we're trying to essentially seduce with those items. Hope this was enjoyable. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.